has 15 members in his very busy three-generational family. So I'd like to begin our program today. The presentation that will be offered is Old Lights, New Lights, which gives a providential perspective on the advancement of the United States history.
Okay.
I think you have probably read some about this and the breakthroughs in spiritual leadership during times of cultural confusion. So I want to open the floor to James, ask him to begin his presentation. I thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol, for that introduction. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So today's topic covers a tremendous amount of history, but it does directly relate to issues of the present. So I might have to sort of skim through the history, but it is kind of relevant to give us a good context to some key issues that we're dealing with in our country at the present time. The title being Old Lights, New Lights. And this topic is a subset of a lecture that a lecture series that Higher Purpose Forum has developed over the last few years, which I'm available to give. The last time I gave the entire contents, which it was a 2-day seminar with 8 different sessions. And I would really love it if, as a result of our meeting today, someone would invite us to present this content to your church or your minister group or your outreach effort, because it's very important providential understanding of our country's history and where we stand at the present time. I'd love to chance to teach it to your community. And this is a subset. I'm going to be focusing on the content, which is primarily from section 8, Understanding Our Present Era. And I wouldn't want anyone to think that this content is based upon my own ideas. I've done a lot of research. There's 20 or 25 books here that I've looked at quite carefully. And the contents from today borrow considerable content from 2 books on that list. One is An Anxious Age by Joseph Bottom, and the second one being Revivals, Awakenings, and Reform, a book by William McLaughlin, which has been discussed numerous times in our sessions. Several of Dr. Beebe's presentations also refer to that book by William McLaughlin. I highly recommend it. Very important study about Great Awakenings. So those of us who study history are aware that there has been a thread of awareness throughout our country's history that our country has before it a divine providence or a covenant with God or a sense of being in a millennial purpose in history. And that theme is present throughout literature and art and politics from the very, very beginnings of our country 400 years ago. We know these truths all have within them a sense of, these quotes all have within them a sense of divine providence or divine destiny that have been articulated by leaders throughout the history of our country. The primary or cornerstone expression of American providence was actually a quote that we all know by John Winthrop, which was stated apparently before disembarking from the Arbella when the Puritans from England got off the boat and to found the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And before that disembarkation, he gave a sermon, and the quote from that sermon that's become a statement of providence, well-known, and it's still constantly referred to, is, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city on a hill. The eyes of the people are upon us, so that if we deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world." So this is a statement at the very beginning of American history about this country having a historical responsibility in the eyes of God. Here's a recent expression of providence that has been very important to me. by Reverend Sun Myung Moon. He gave a speech at Yankee Stadium on June 1st, 1976, called America's God's Hope. It's a wonderful speech, and in that speech comes the following quote: "America is a microcosm of the world, transcending nationality and race. America has created a model for the ideal world. God himself had purposely hidden this land from America, from civilization, until his time was full. And then upon her, God raised up this model nation. In his providence, God anointed America with oil. He poured out abundant blessing upon this land. In a short 200 years, God raised this nation to be the mightiest nation on earth. But blessing never comes alone. It comes with responsibility. If one forsakes responsibility, one also forsakes God's blessings." And this understanding that America has a responsibility to be a microcosm of an ideal world is expressed in the core creed of the Unification Faith, what we call our family pledge. Paragraph 4 commits unificationists to build a universal family and perfect the world of freedom, peace, unity, and happiness by centering upon true love, which is a restatement of this understanding that's presented in the speech from 1976. So it's very important for us to understand this country as a country that is moving forward, continuously being pushed forward towards a future fulfillment. And this providential progress is very clear if you study American history. It's been underway since the very beginning of the country, and it's underway right now, and we have a long way to go. And the topic of our meeting today is, what is the cause or the basis for forward progress, providential progress? Why is American history, or any country that has a providential role, not just American, how does it move forward in history? How does providential progress occur? And I've spent the last 4 years working on this question. Providential advancement has occurred across 4 time periods in the United States, beginning with the arrival of the enslaved Americans and the colonists in 1619, 1620 until the beginning of the American Revolution. Then from the American Revolution to the beginning of the Civil War, from the Civil War to the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, and then the present period that we're in now is what I would say began in 1955, and we're living through it still. And within each one of those 4 time periods, there's a progression of 5 stages. It's very distinctive. And I came across this for the first time when I was reading the details of the Reconstruction period. And I read and studied the details of the Reconstruction period. And I realized that the story of Reconstruction is just like the story of the founding of the United States. It's just like the story of the colonial period. It had so many time parallels. And if you actually look carefully at all these different periods in history, you see there's 5 stages in each of these periods. The period begins with a new vision articulated by a providential leader, a conflict, a war, and then the institutionalization of that new expression of freedom into institutional permanent forms around which civilization can be built. And then there's a counter reaction to that expression of freedom, and there's a period of cultural distortion. And then, as a response to the cultural distortion, there's a cultural awakening. And the cultural awakening leads to cultural reform and eventually new providential leadership and another confrontation. In today's talk, we're going to just cover C and D, cultural distortion and cultural awakening. And let's look carefully at cultural distortion. In cultural distortion, we see that the leaders of the culture are promoting an outmoded worldview. And it's defended by what we call old lights, who are who are defenders of a corrupted status quo that's outdated. And as a result of this outmoded thinking, we have the problem of institutional malfunction. And the way forward for the country is blocked. The people lose confidence in the future of the country. And there's a sense of discouragement. And as a result of this period of darkness, arrives the next phase in history. And we're now, I would say this has happened 3 or we can say 4 times in the past, an awakening occurs. And the awakening is a direct challenge to the compromised status quo. And that awakening has 3 phases. First, a spiritual revival. And the central figure in this first stage are charismatic evangelists, who we call new lights. And they bring new ways of thinking about old problems, new understanding of old truths. It's not called new truth. It's a new understanding of old truth. It's called new light on old truth. Second step is a broadened awakening in which the impact of the spiritual revival goes beyond the religious movement and moves into the culture itself. And it leads to a new level of social activism and a refreshing or renewal of culture. And once that social activism is underway, over time, a new consensus is formed in society, a renewal of confidence, and a clear understanding of a renewed worldview. So there's a pattern in history. And we see and that new consensus is what enables political change to take place. When there's a new consensus of values and a new way of thinking accepted broadly in society, then politics can change, new leadership can emerge, and a providential change can take place based upon that new consensus, which was initially brought by the new light. So we see this sequence: cultural and political dysfunction, new spiritual leadership, new lights, a new religious movement, cultural change, where there's a broadening impact of the new lights and a beginning of a shift in the prevailing ideological consensus, and that leads to eventual political change. So it's a well-established pattern in American history. So this paradigm we're talking about is what I would say is this new light, old light, new light paradigm is not the same as the paradigm that a lot of us think about how history moves forward based upon the separation of good and evil using a Cain-Abel paradigm. This is a different paradigm. The old light, new light paradigm is an understanding based upon the impacts of different leaders on whether or not they hold the providence back or move the providence forward. Old lights are people and leaders who have a way of thinking that is blocking the advance of providence, and new lights are leaders who are able to push the providence forward. Providential role of new light. God is not conservative. He is not interested in past accomplishment. He is not satisfied with the status quo. He's looking forward to the future fulfillment of his plan. Therefore, he is an innovator, always building, always moving forward toward the future. And America has a responsibility in the plan for God's future. So therefore, America must continuously press forward, always becoming better. New light is sent by God or comes from God to force forward progress. Changing conditions require God to continuously shed new light on unchanging truths. New light powers personal rebirth, religious renewal, and a departure from the corruption of the past. Religious renewal is followed by cultural, social, and then political change. Old light clings to old thinking and the status quo, ignoring, even persecuting new light. Old light holds back the advance of providence. The stubbornness of old lights creates an opportunity for new lights to win over those who are confused in this period of cultural distortion. So we can actually see that the very birth of our country came from the emergence of new lights. You know, there was the Puritan awakening was an awakening, a response to the ossified and corrupt Anglican hierarchy in England. And the New Lights established English Puritanism, which was an awakening from 1560 to 1660. And among the New Lights of the Puritan awakening or the Puritan Reformation were the Pilgrim and Puritan Fathers who came to the United States in 1620. So the New Lights, those men and women who founded America and brought new light culture to our country, they were the fruit of an awakening that occurred in England. And here the names are listed: William Bradford, William Brewster, John Winthrop, Anne Hutchinson, Roger Williams, and many others. And the renewed values of this Puritan awakening, the renewed and clarified values of Puritanism became the cultural core of our country. And this awakening that came from a group of spiritual leaders actually brought with it not only a theology, but also a political vision and social theory. So it enabled not only a new way of religious thinking, but a new way for culture to form, a new way to form political institutions, rooted in the ideas of New Light. So I'm just going to very quickly go through these three periods of U.S. history. I'm going to have to sort of skim through this, but there's been not only the Puritan awakening, but I would say three awakenings since then that have pushed American history forward. The first occurred prior to the American Revolution. It's called the First Great Awakening. At that time, there was compromised standards in the colonies, a loss of direction. And we can point specifically, I'm sure there's other factors we could point to, but the ones listed here are the emergence of chattel slavery, initially from Virginia, the failure of the Mass Bay Colony in the late 1600s, and the proliferation of secularism in the colonies, a sense of sort of discouragement and a loss of way. And as a result of that, there emerged a Great Awakening. And the New Lights of that First Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, Gilbert Tennant, Samuel Davies, Eleazar Wheelock, their thinking was that allowed a spiritual and cultural phenomena to spread across all the colonies. All 13 colonies were eventually impacted by the First Great Awakening because of these traveling itinerant preachers. And their primary focus was on individual conversion. But in the process of this awakening, a national identity was created that pulled the colonies together based upon a sense of unity through religious pluralism. And the colonists regarded the First Great Awakening as a sign from God of the millennial expectation for a new nation. So it had this cultural impact, and it led ultimately to the sense of unity and purpose that led to the Revolutionary War. Most people would agree that if it wasn't for the First Great Awakening, there might have been 13 countries independent of one another rather than one country, the United States, fighting against England. The next Great Awakening in the second period, also well known in American history, arose in response to compromised standards after the War of Independence, restricted voting rights, a plantation economy, a proliferation of slavery and the slave trade, a very deep divide between North and South, which ultimately became the Confederacy and the Union, and a secularization of religious standards and the emergence of deism. And in response to that cultural distortion. Another awakening occurred, which is called the Second Great Awakening, 1800 to 1830. We see here some of the names of some of the new lights associated with the Second Great Awakening. Lyman Beecher, Nathaniel Taylor, I got him twice. Timothy Dwight, Charles Finney, who's probably the one that most people know of. Ashel Nettleton. It was another very similar to the First Awakening. It was a spiritual and cultural phenomena led by itinerant preachers. And the sense was that individuals could be regenerated and pulled out of personal confusion, and therefore the same thing can happen to a society, that a society can be reformed and made benevolent. And that was the thrust of the Second Great Awakening. And during the process of this awakening, slavery came to be seen as immoral and inconsistent with America's millennial expectation. And the cultural change that resulted from the Great Awakening led to the abolition movement and eventually to the Civil War. Then we have the third period, the Third Great Awakening, and there's some people who would dispute whether there really was a Third Great Awakening. But when I study American history and I see what happened in the decades of the early 1900s prior to civil rights, I see very clear evidence of a Third Great Awakening. The compromise standards at that time were generally regarded as, in one area, especially in the South, where there was de jure Jim Crow, but there was also de facto Jim Crow throughout the North, including in the city where I grew up in, Boston. And there's probably three areas of Jim Crow impact: disenfranchisement, segregation, and discrimination against African Americans. There's also a very profound impact from the rapid urbanization, the advance of development of cities, especially in the North, in the industrialized North, and the impact of Darwinism on religion. And in this context of cultural confusion emerged the Third Great Awakening. And the new lights, I'm not sure this is the right list, but the names that are often associated with the Third Awakening would be Harry Fosdick, Walter Rauschenbusch, John Bascom, Friedrich Schleiermacher, Washington Gladden, and Charles Parham. These are religious leaders who were prominent influencers in the early years of the Third Awakening, and their religious revival drew attention not so much towards original sin, but towards something that became known as social sin, sins of the society that were impacting individual lives because of laissez-faire individualism, the need for social action to correct social sin and protect people from the impact of urbanization, industrialization, and Jim Crow. The understanding that science and religion can protect individuals from heartlessness of modernity. And it did spawn a widespread advance of social activism, led to prohibition, new labor laws, unionization, numerous religious movements, and a whole momentum for missionary work around the world. There's a list of, I would say, the social impact of the Third Awakening: the social gospel movement, the women's suffrage movement, prohibition, the founding of the NAACP, the founding of unions, including the Brotherhood of Porters, the founding of racial equality organizations, including CORE, and eventually the momentum that led to the momentous Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision in 1954. And these breakthroughs are directly referred to in the history of civil rights. I mean, Martin Luther King points back to these very spiritual influences, especially to Walter Rauschenbusch, as the inspiration behind the social action that caused the cultural and political change of civil rights. So now we're in a fourth period, and we see a new vision. I'm going to go a little bit more detail in this period, but I would say that the providential figure who began the current period was Martin Luther King, and he had a vision, and that vision mobilized a movement, and that movement caused social and political change, new institutionalization of new laws, specifically the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, 1965, and 1968 have transformed this country. The culture of this country is entirely different because of the end of Jim Crow, de facto and de jure Jim Crow around the United States that was a result of this new national legislation under President Nixon and President Johnson. And yet we have now, as a result of that, we're now in a period, as I think we recognize, a period of cultural distortion we're living through right now. There's been in our own time, we see a breakdown of a social consensus, a redefinition, a radical redefinition of marriage and family, a radical decline in social norms and social civility. On the extreme right, what I would call white nativism. On the extreme left, what I would call woke deconstruction. These are political ideologies. We see a very serious weakening of democratic institutions in our country, which is in the news constantly now, and culture wars. So now we're in a new era of cultural distortion, a reaction to a lot of it is a reaction to the new culture that was brought to our country based upon the new institutionalization following civil rights era. A lot of it's a reaction to that. So a question that occurs to me that I've looked into is, why is all this breakdown and distortion happening? What is the underlying cause of cultural distortion in the current day? And to understand that, I did a lot of reading, and one book I found was particularly influential on me was Joseph Bottom's book called An Anxious Age. He describes the United States as a three-legged stool. When you build a stool, you have three legs, and the tension of each leg supports the other two. A three-legged stool is a structure in which each leg is required to support each other and to support the stool. And our country is built like a three-legged stool. One leg is the religious leg, the economic leg, and the political leg. They all are integrated and rely on one another. And specifically, the religious leg has created the basis for a long-term basis for social consensus within our country. Ever since the beginning of the country, there's been a social consensus built around the culture and the values of mainline Protestantism. Mainline Protestantism is defined by, most currently by this list of churches. And this is not a single church, but it's a chorus of churches that share a broad set of values and a vision for the future and a place in American life. And it's the social consensus that has been created by mainline Protestantism that has given rise to the kind of economy that we have. And I would not really call our economy capitalist. I would call it an economy, the term that economists use is an economy of consumer sovereignty, free market economy. And also coming out of the ethics and the values of mainline Protestantism is democracy, a government for the people, of the people, for the people, and by the people. And what's happened in our country is that there's been a severe decline since mid-1960s of mainline Protestantism. That's what's my understanding. That's what's behind, or the basis of cultural distortion in our country, is a decline of social consensus. And that is because of the decline of mainline Protestantism. In 1965, when I grew up, I went to a congregational church like everybody else in my town. It was just a standard part of life where I lived in Massachusetts, and over 50% of the US population were active participants in mainline Protestantism. And that percentage has dropped off a cliff since the late 1960s, and it's now down to somewhere between 10, at the very, very most, 14% of the US population. But that data is a little bit old. Not only is it a very low number, but there's no very low intergenerational retention. Children aren't following in their parents' footsteps. The average age, if you go to a Baptist church or a Methodist church or a congregational church, is 55 and rising. It's an elderly population. Most of the denominations have been badly split in half, beginning in the late 60s, between the liberal and conservative wing of the church. The church has become divided. There's no evangelism, no outreach going on, no multiplication. And these churches are expected to continue to decline in their prominence in our culture. So this has led to a very important decline, or significant decline, in the traditional basis for social consensus in our country. So it is the decline, in my view, the decline of the social consensus. It was rooted in mainline Christianity. It has led to all these other dysfunctions in the United States. And we see, according to this framework, that it is in the context of this period of cultural distortion that one would expect an awakening to take place to resolve these issues of confusion. We see the need for a culture awakening and a new consensus in our country is badly needed, but the missing ingredient is the awakening itself, is the source of new light. Where is the new light going to come from that's going to spark religious renewal and cultural awakening and lead the country forward away from this period of confusion and distortion? I would say, based upon a number of books, including the book by McLaughlin, there seems to be evidence there's been a number of failed attempts to bring new light to the United States since the late 1960s. A lot of researchers point to a number of movements that have arisen and kind of failed. The first of those being the second social reformation. People refer to it, that's how it's referred to. Excuse me, the second Reformation. These are social reform movements from the late 1960s. At the time, there was a big hope that these were going to carry our country forward, and they sputtered away. There's the emergence of a new form of Protestantism, liberal Protestantism, under the umbrella of the National Council of Churches. It's certainly present, but it's not the basis for a new consensus. There's the emergence of the National New Right, which many of us have had contact with, the Moral Majority, Pat Robertson, the Christian Coalition. They emerged very strongly in the 80s, but they did not become the basis for a new cultural consensus. They're certainly present, but they're one of many voices. The neo-evangelicals that are present in the development of the Protestant Church and the Catholic Church, but most would consider those to be not a basis for an awakening for various reasons. And I would say the Unification Church movement was an attempt at an awakening. I know the founder of the Unification Church movement, Reverend Moon, definitely spoke in his speeches expecting there to be a large response and a renewal in the United States based upon the large nationwide movement that was organized under unificationism in those years. But it never really gained traction in the culture. What happened to these new light movements? What went wrong? I would say two things. First, an inappropriate offering. They were exclusivist and not very accommodating to the broader culture. They were inflexible, had sort of a narrow and dogmatic theology. A lot of these Christian churches, very narrow theology. And I would say many of them have a problem with their eschatology. They have a pre-millennial eschatology, which is distinctly un-American. This is my opinion, but it does definitely come up in the literature. The eschatology of some of these church movements is out of sync with the future of our country. And also these new light movements, religious movements had to emerge in a very harsh culture of our country, a very harsh environmental cultural environment. Profound cultural and ethnic diversity. It's difficult to navigate and create consensus in such diversity. Profound religious pluralism, unlike anything in our country's past since the 1960s. Non-negotiable rights and freedoms demanded by Americans now. Very, very harsh demands for individualism and individual freedom and rights. The intensity and the centrality of mass entertainment and the social media culture. It's such a distraction for most people. And very importantly, inertia of the affluent, those who protect the status quo, who are powerful and defenders of the status quo. They're not really interested in a change in the social consensus. They want to protect what's theirs. So I think in this environment where the most precious element in providential advance is the emergence and the recognition of new light. So I would like to say that we should, in our own life, we should be evaluating and looking for sources of new life. I would suggest looking for that within our religious community, seeing where new light is emerging within our religious community, who's bringing inspired new ideas, who's bringing a clear vision of the future, a clear plan for the future, trying to build towards a providential success, who's capable of creating a new social consensus out of a religious movement. In the US religious landscape, thinking what religious groups can be part of a new consensus, can respond to new light, what religious groups are open to new ways of thinking, what religious groups can we work with who can be inspired or have an inspired vision for the future, and who can attract and be part of a new social consensus. Some religions are really, I would say, old light culture. They're not open to new ways of thinking, and they're not open to a different consensus. They may not be part of the way forward. And in our political environment, I think we can also evaluate candidates, for instance, at the presidential level. Which candidates do we see have an inspired vision for the future, who are talking about the future versus talking and hung up in the past? Which political leader will be open to new light, will be open to new ideas and new solutions? I think these are questions, at least for me, that I'm asking myself constantly, and looking at my own religious community, and looking at the religious landscape in the United States and the political environment, particularly at the presidential level, where the president has such an impact on the future of the country. So I'd like to just make a few concluding considerations for evaluating, how do we evaluate new light leadership? This is based upon my study. These are the criteria that I would use in evaluating someone or a movement as to whether they might represent new light. Does that person or that movement recognize the providence and push it forward, offering a new vision for the future, new light, or does it deny and ignore the providence, looking backwards, holding it back? Is the leader spiritually transformative, bringing new and inspired answers to real contemporary problems? Is its orientation, values, and behavior consistent with the US becoming a model nation, building a universal family, specifically universal citizenship rights, shared opportunity, and social integration. I'm going to turn my light on here, excuse me. Fourth, is it respectful and aligned with the plumb line of the U.S. Providence? Is it respectful and aligned with our Pilgrim core, our founding fathers, the very important role and course and contribution of enslaved Americans, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King? A lot of social movements and political movements do not identify with that plumb line of U.S. province. I don't think they can be a source of new light, therefore. Does the leader respect and uplift and promote national sovereignty, America's responsibility as what we call the elder son nation, the institutions of democracy and religious freedom? So in conclusion, I would say that final considerations, drawing upon the material we've just covered, I'd just like to make a few final points. A period of cultural distortion creates fertile soil upon which new spiritual movements guided by new light can take root and thrive. The providence advances not by the creation of a new church, which can be so easily targeted and torn down, but through a broad spiritual movement that can create impact and social consensus. All the awakenings of the past were not just one church, they were a whole group of churches and leaders and ideas working together. They weren't just one church leading the way. The spiritual movement must be built around new light. Our responsibility is to identify and support and disseminate new life. The process of moving from the emergence of new lights to the development of a new cultural consensus that can then have political impact requires sophisticated leadership and takes a very long time. This transition from new light to a religious movement to cultural impact of political change takes a long time. Political change occurs when political change occurs without an underlying social consensus. Social instability is created. That's why these initiatives like prohibition or constitutional access to abortion, they were not built upon social consensus, so they didn't last. A country cannot develop itself without a way of arriving at consensus, in other words, without freedom of speech. We have to be very careful and appreciate that it's inaccurate to conflate old lights with being on the Cain side or being evil. Old lights are not evil. Old lights are old. They're stuck in their ways. They're stubborn, but they're not necessarily evil. Numerous new light attempts have failed in recent decades because of their inappropriate offering and because of the harsh cultural environment in which they operate. And finally, a spiritual movement built with new light in this country must now be more universal, pluralistic, and global than any spiritual movement of the past. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Wow. 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 Jim, that was a great deal of information that was given, very enlightening. Thank you so much. I want to simply introduce our respondent at this time. Our respondent is Dr. Mike Michler. Mike is a distinguished professor of historical studies at the HJ, that is Hyojung, International Graduate School of Peace and Public Leadership. Mike, just, I don't want to use up any of your time. I'm sure you have a great deal to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, James. I feel like I had just gotten through a doctoral dissertation here in your presentation. Just a massive amount of detail that you've pulled together. I don't want to spend too long. I just want to express a few points of appreciation and then a few comments, and then we'll get to the discussion. So I would say this is the second time I've been a respondent. The other time was Robert Beebe, who spoke on God's providence since the civil rights movement. And I believe your presentation, like his, bears the stamp of a distinctively unification approach. That is to say, it's very bold and prophetic. You cover the entire sweep of US history, including the colonial period, America's story. And you do so within a providential perspective, so it's prophetic as well as being bold. And you don't hold back from diagnosing what's the holdup in America, holding back the providential mandate. So I'm appreciative of that. I'm appreciative of your investment, the great amount of work that went into your presentation. The bibliographical page gives a sense of that. I know you've been working in these materials for a long time. And then you provide a sort of interesting theoretical model for the progression of the providence, progress of the providence, right? So you bring up the new light, old light division, their interaction, the periods of US history, and how the new lights and old lights interact. And I felt your presentation really kind of built up to, it was sort of like a wave that was gathering. I felt like I was out in the ocean for a while, and I might have been even drowning, but that wave gathered impetus, and then it came crashing onto the shore in the last part of your presentation, dealt with the period through which we're passing now. And I thought it was very hard-hitting, and you had a lot of very interesting and helpful insights that I think will stimulate some good conversation. Now, a few comments, just two or three comments. I want to point out, you do take a bold and prophetic approach, a typically unification approach, but I want to say that there are continuities between your approach and scholarly research in general. I was really pleased that you drove me back to take a look at McLaughlin again, for example, and his important work, Revivals, Awakenings, and Reform. Yes. And it's really probably the best known study of these revitalization movements in US history. And your presentation has a great deal of continuity with his. He states at the heart of American culture are the following beliefs: that Americans are a chosen people. It was evident in Winthrop as well. They have a manifest or latent destiny to lead the world to the millennium. That America operates under a body of higher moral laws, and to transgress them will threaten our destiny. And that the Judeo-Christian personal and social ethic causes the general welfare to thrive by allowing the greatest possible freedom and opportunity for each individual to fulfill his or her potential. And McLaughlin goes so far as to define America as a millennial movement. And its 4 great awakenings have enabled the country to meet crises and challenges while keeping its cultural core intact. So I would say your presentation is within the framework of a larger tradition of American religious historiography and scholarship. So I wouldn't say it's marginal. No, I say it was at the core of important traditions of scholarship. So the second comment would be on this new light, old light distinction that you draw. For me, it was a little more binary than it needs to be. You're clearly focusing positive attention on the new lights, rightly so. But at least in the PowerPoint that I got in advance of this presentation, to the extent that old lights are mentioned, they're usually clinging to old thinking, persecuting, and holding back the providence. So they're not evil, but they're not doing great things. And that's probably accurate in describing the conflict between new and old lights, but it does neglect a few points that McLaughlin raises about new lights and old lights. For example, it neglects to acknowledge extremist elements in the new light camp, particularly in the early stages. Extreme emotionalism, harsh judgmentalism, exaggerated rhetoric that inspires terror in people. We might think of the existential threats commonly raised by today's environmental activists, for example, that literally scare the pants off of people. I'd like to read just a very brief thing from McLaughlin's introduction, where he says that there's a negative side to every new light movement, and often the most pietistic and perfectionist new lights become the most destructive. They deify their leaders, they invert Christian rituals, denigrate the individual. Eventually, the more moderate new lights repudiate such extremists in order to establish their own stability and order. The fact is that it's often the extremist element within new lights that arouses the old lights in the first place. It also bears mentioning, as McLaughlin does, that awakenings never repudiate the old views entirely. The new consensus carries within it elements from before. In fact, that's the definition of conservatism. You want to conserve elements. You want to conserve traditional values. So I think this is also consistent with the unification headwing idea, where elements and ideas of conflicting parties need to be resolved in an emerging consensus. And the consensus is not total victory of one party over the other. So I would say that this could be more strongly emphasized. And the last comment I would make has to do with applying all of these wise points to, our situation. We're clearly, I think, in a period of individual stress and cultural distortion. And I think that's true at the macro level in terms of the United States as a whole. I think it's also true at micro levels in which we live, especially within our religious traditions. In the case of unification tradition, which many here partake, actually it's strongly believed that the micro and macro are closely intersecting and influence one another. What occurs at the micro level influences the macro and vice versa. So if new light, old light conflict erupts in the wider society, as most would agree it has, it seems to me that the unification tradition ought to identify new light and old light sides pretty clearly, and ideally try to mediate between the two. I think that would be a headwing approach.
Yeah.
If the new light, old light conflict erupts within the unification tradition itself, as also seems to have happened to some degree, that would likely interfere with the unification mission, unless that old light, new light division is healed, mediated, or overcome. So the question then is how to discern new light solutions and work with them. And Jim's presentation offered helpful criteria to identify new light approaches. It remains to apply them and achieve consensus. So that would be my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Michler, and thank you for staying within your time period. Although we are a little overtime in our overall timing. So I just want to get on to the comments and questions. Chris Kennedy has his hand raised. Go ahead, Chris. You're welcome to speak.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Professor Etterly, for that excellent presentation. I noticed that there are interesting biblical tracks that kind of fit into this new light, old light duality. In Revelation, they say that the stars will turn to blood, the fall from the sky, or excuse me, the sun will turn to blood. And this idea that old lights will fail and that new lights will come through. You know, that there will come a new word that will render down the elements and melt them. So all this fits into that sort of, you know, kind of spiraling dynamic, which I find very interesting. Now, that said, I also find that this dynamic of new light, old light, and kind of the friction between them bears sort of a mirrored resemblance to the communist dialectic.
Yes.
You know, their historicity,
Yes.
that idea of,
Yeah.
you know, the new and the old are gonna get on each other's nerve, and the new has to destroy the old to move forward.
Yes.
Yeah, it has an uncomfortable resemblance, but I notice it doesn't say they have to destroy each other. And there seems to be this idea that there should be congruence between. So it's not like, you know, I get the sense it's not like the Chinese idea where they had to destroy as much of their culture as possible to make way for their new preferred centrally planned culture. But maybe you can make some commentary on that kind of echoing.
It's so interesting you make that observation, Chris. I came across that over and over again. It looks like a dialectical process, not a good evil thing, but a thesis. And from the thesis comes the antithesis. And then out of that arises a new synthesis. It looks like that. I think what we should do is have Chris Kennedy give a talk on higher purpose form about the dialectical understanding of new lights and old lights.
I have to say, I'm very happy to see a young person here on this forum. Go ahead.
But Chris, there must be something to it because it seems very apparent, doesn't it? There must be something to it. You know, it's the old light, new light framework isn't something that we find within, you know, unificationism, but it's certainly evident in history. So we should really study it a little bit. And I think a dialectical evaluation would be helpful. What do you think about that, Dr. Michler?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think the old light, new light, I mean, it's in the unification principle itself. In the introduction, it talks about the new light will in the terms of a new biblical, and yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I think yeah, God, I mean, it's very biblical. God has new light to break forth from God's holy word in the scriptures, and then that new light interacts with the previous understandings in a kind of dialectical manner to find a higher purpose and a higher synthesis, or that gradually gains traction.
Great. Sounds like a commercial for Higher Purpose Forum.
Well, the great biblical example of new lights are the prophets.
Yeah.
That's the kind of classic illustration of how a new light operates. And they get the crap kicked out of them every time.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to go on I thank you for all the comments. I'd like to go on to John O'Connor. John, go ahead. Anybody else who has a question, please raise your hand or a comment.
Hi, James. Good to see you. Yeah, I have a question a little bit about, could the civility movement be something that would maybe help to transform culture as the future goes? Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah. So, you know, we have some different movements here in America. I'm sure you probably know about Bravery Angels.
Yes.
You've heard about them? Yeah. But they're maybe could be spearheading that. There's also the StoryCorps. which brings people together. And one of them I signed up to be take a person of the opposite political and cultural view that I am, and have a session together and try to become buddies. You know how it works. So I think it's very powerful. You know, there's another thing in Utah. They have what's called a dignity index,
Oh,
kind
yeah.
of along the same lines. You know, and trying to espouse love number 8 over contempt is number 1.
Yes.
So try to analyze what are your feelings and where you fit on the index, you know, compared to your heart toward people and your attitude. You know, so those several things like that, I think, could be part of a growing. I think the StoryCorps has like 650,000 stories of people loving each other, sharing stories together, getting to know each other. You know, it's really wonderful. And one more thing about African Americans. I wonder now if they begin to grow and understand the light that they have been duped last many decades and have broken their families up by political means, and that they can find a way to get back together and reestablish marriage in their communities and stability in that way. And I think also just marriage in sum total maybe will be coming back. I think I saw a book headline, something about marriage cannot be denied, something like that. So I wonder if those are part of movements that possibly could be changing in African American community and marriage and in this area of civility.
Mhm.
You know,
I think that there must be many ways in which God is bringing new light. There must be, if God cares about this country. And among the interesting examples that you mentioned, the one that I know about fairly well is Braver Angels. I went to the national convention, yeah, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania for 5 days in July. And I was very impressed with the future-oriented, religious-friendly, very, very religion-friendly, deeply religious. Most of the leadership is quite religious, actually.
Yeah.
I think they're a very significant source of new light. The other ones you mentioned, I'm not all that aware of, but I personally am intending to get involved with Braver Angels because it allows, and I was not the only unificationist at this convention, by the way.
right.
So that's a very interesting and hopeful and huge, very well-led, well-organized operation.
It's very stable. Yeah,
Yes.
agreed.
You got excellent leadership.
Thank
Very
you.
able type, new light. Yeah. Thanks.
Amen.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Did you want to make any word, Mike? I'll go on to Jim Hughes. Jim?
Yes, Jim, thank you so much. That was very comprehensive presentation, well researched, having a book bibliography there, about 25, 30 books. Geez. My question is this: I often watch, they call it TBN, Trinity Broadcasting Network, and it shows people like Rick Warren, this fella Andrew Womack, Joel Osteen, and I think they get millions of viewers. And I was curious if you have any insight into whether TBN, and they seem to be ecumenical with the evangelicals. I don't think the mainline Protestant Christianity would be involved there, but I was curious if you felt that they would play some role as a new light, and if there's some way that even the unification movement could work with them. Thank you.
Well, I don't, Jim, but I'm curious. Thank you for mentioning that. I'm curious. I'll look into that because we really need to find out where New Light is coming from and connect with them, right?
Trinity Broadcast Network, I mean, they have excellent programming, and they're on like our cable network, and they reach millions of people. So,
awesome. Yeah,
quite a setup.
Yeah, we should connect with them.
But the trick is to connect the pietistic religiosity with social the kind of social striving, social justice agenda. And you know, they tend to retreat into the privatistic realms, and whereas the you know, a lot of the element that opposes them is more into transforming social society. And I think a true New Light movement has to encompass both dimensions. Wouldn't you agree, Jim?
Yeah.
And the heart, yes. The head, yes. The will, yes. All of the above has to work into a consensus. And so I think you've said before, Jim, you don't see the conservative evangelical movement offering really the way forward into a realistic new awakening.
Unless a social movement can change institutions, they don't have any lasting impact. They have to get into, ultimately have to get involved with changing institutions, with permanent change. Yeah. And if you're just interested in church level activism, it doesn't lead towards a social consensus or institutional improvement.
Mhm.
I think you have to have a family-centered movement that has a broader vision and a higher purpose than just the nuclear family, as important as that is. And I think unification has strived to embody that approach. But for reasons that Jim outlined, it's been rough sledding.
Yep. I don't see other hands lifted. I would like to see anybody else with comments that they want to make, but I want to say personally, I think as unificationists, one of our responsibility is really to connect people. That every person here, you may be interested in this particular Methodist group. It's important to reach out to that group and to make a connection so that you can connect them to the other groups. Every person here is connected to some group, but we really need to be active, especially as unificationists. Unification, I mean, that's what we're talking about, creating unification. But it takes an amount of activism on the part of every one of us to connect to the group that we're interested in and to help to create synergy between those to help make that movement happen. That's my personal comment there. Leslie, your hand's raised. Oh, please unmute.
Yeah, this reminds me of what happens in medicine. It was quite a while ago in the 1700s. Dr. Semmelweis from where is he from? Hungary, I believe. He found a way to prevent childbirth fever, but his methods were not accepted by the current generation because they wanted to hold on to what was familiar. And it actually took the whole generation to die out and for a new generation to come up before his ideas could be accepted. And he actually killed himself with the same infection because he couldn't stand the thought of so many women dying needlessly. So I wonder, how much of it is we need to find the people prepared who we can work with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, it's quite a story. Same thing happened with the discovery of antibiotics. It took so long, right? And the cost was so high in terms of unnecessary loss of life. Yeah.
Seems like our expected 3 years of change doesn't always happen in 3 years. It looks more like 300 or a few thousand. Thank you.
I think John Williams has his hand raised there.
Yeah, I didn't see it, but please, John.
You can hear me now, right?
New name is Kathy.
Yeah, I guess it is. Kathy, that's funny. Jim, I'm so impressed. That was fantastic. But a simple question: why not Cain and Abel? why is it not a Cain-Abel relationship? You have the elder, you have an elder who doesn't want to give up position, who wants to build himself up, tear down the newcomer. I mean, it just seems like it's a Cain-Abel relationship.
You see. Well, I can give you my opinion. Maybe Dr. Mickler is a.
Stop slipping the questions over to me, Jim.
I'll
Okay.
take it. Maybe it's both.
I think that when you're talking about Cain Abel, you're talking about forces that are intentionally in opposition to God. They're intentionally opposed to what God is trying to do. They represent a force that's opposed to God. And I think old lights aren't like that.
But
I get kicked out of churches, and I am getting kicked out by old lights. These people are wonderful ministers. They love their parishioners. They're devoted to God and they love their country, but they're standing in the way of the providence. I just don't think that's the same as someone who hates God.
gee, I never thought of Cain as one who hates God. Cain loved God. He wanted to be approved by God. But rather, Cain is the one who simply is stuck, old. I mean, the Pharisees and all, I mean, it just seems like always the present religious institution, they always oppose the new prophets coming up because they don't understand, they don't appreciate them. So it's not a matter of sincerity or hating God himself. They just inadvertently stand in the way of God's will without knowing it. That's what I always thought it was, that Cain often is sincerely motivated, but just misguided. And he's holding up the good stuff. But maybe I'm wrong. But that's how I was always a relative position. Neither Cain is not evil, but it's a relative position.
Relative position,
Yeah.
We have a Cain Abel expert in our room here. We have a world-class Cain Abel in Dr. Thomas Cromwell. He wrote a book on Cain and Abel.
That's right. There you go.
I wonder if we can get him to help us here.
Nice invitation.
Yeah, people have lots of ideas about Cain and Abel, and some people believe it's no longer an operating paradigm. We're living in an age beyond Cain and Abel.
Right.
There will always be Cain and Abel, those closer to God and those further away. But I agree with John, it's a relative thing. And that's the whole point. Cain has to be restored to become Abel-like. So whatever Abel-like elements he has have to be inspired and challenged and appealed to by Abel. That's sort of the mission with Old Light, I think, is to put it into a new light context.
Well, Thomas, do you think that Old Light, New Light is a different? This is kind of theoretical, but I'm not sure it's all that helpful. But do you think it is a different paradigm than Cain and Abel, or do you think it's a Cain Abel paradigm?
I think Cain and Abel is embedded in almost every difference between two human beings, two movements, two ideas. The point is that the providence advances by leveraging that difference. That's how God advances the providence, is by choosing the position closer to him to advance and to try and repress or win over Cain's side, to surrender to the Abel agenda. So I think, the paradigm of new light, old light seems to me very, very helpful. It's positive about both old and new. And I think that's what you're saying, Jim, is that it's not just because they're out of date that they're necessarily bad. It's just that they're out of date. And they have a very partial picture of the providence themselves. Their religious world is too narrow.
Yeah.
And it's hard for God to use people in that position. I think that's the whole beauty of the divine principle. It sort of blows so much of that old stuff out of the window and opens a way for collaboration on a much higher level, not only among denominations, but among religions. So the question really, I think, is how does the divine principle become an agenda of success, an ideology that succeeds in bringing the right people together to change the world? I think one has to be frank, the theory is one thing, but the divisions in the unification movement are profoundly problematic in this respect. And, I think that has to be discussed at some point.
Mhm, mhm. Thank you very much, Tom. I want to point out that we have just 2 minutes left. So I'd like to ask James and Mike if you want to each take a minute to make a last comment, or if there's any last comments that need to be made from the floor. Anybody?
Well, I would say in terms of the dialectical discussion that came up earlier, I think unification has a concept of origin, division, and union, right? Which is our sort of dialectic, I think. And I think I'd like to see a conversation. I mean, there used to be Christian Marxist dialogue, and we have victory over communism. But I think, that whole dialectical element that Chris brought up, and you responded favorably to, Jim, speaks to the kind of dialogue between Cain and Abel, or new light, old light, I think that needs to happen. And hopefully your forum and others can be platforms where that can occur.
Very good.
Good.
Thank you. Jim, last moment comment.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for listening. Higher Purpose Forum, we're trying to develop content that can help in our outreach. And this is a forum to develop content, really. And so I appreciate everyone's willingness to listen and to converse. And I really appreciate Dr. Mickler's involvement. He's been so helpful in so many ways with Higher Purpose Forum. It's very, very helpful. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I hope we can all be around when our next meeting happens on October 21st.
Okay, thank you, everybody, very much. It's exactly 6:30. God bless you all, and thank you for taking part in this forum today. Be well.
Thank you.